The man standing beside the casket wiped his eyes, turned slightly toward the light coming through the chapel window, and for 3 full seconds, I forgot how to breathe. It was Daniel's jaw. Daniel's hands shoved deep into his coat pockets exactly the way he always stood when he was uncomfortable. Daniel, who I had buried 10 months earlier in a closed casket funeral my mother in law insisted on rushing through before I could fully process what had happened. Daniel, who was supposed to be dead, was standing at a stranger's funeral 300 miles from home. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, hit the like button now. If you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, comment here below and subscribe to Story Retribution because today's ending proves that karma always arrives, just not when people expect it. Daniel and I had been married for 6 years when the accident happened. He ran the family business, Whitcomb Industrial Supply, alongside his mother, Vivian, and his younger brother, Preston, a mid-sized manufacturing company his late father had built decades earlier. Daniel was the one who actually ran operations day to day, the one employees respected, the one who understood every contract and client relationship better than anyone else in the family. Vivian never fully trusted me. I came from a working class family, married into old manufacturing money, and Vivian made it clear over the years, through careful, polite condescension, that she considered me someone who had done quite well for herself rather than someone who genuinely belonged in the family. Preston, softer and less confrontational than his mother, mostly stayed out of the tension between us, though I always sensed he deferred entirely to Vivian's opinions rather than forming his own. The small betrayal happened about a year before the accident, during a company holiday party where Vivian introduced me to new clients as Daniel's wife, omitting my name entirely, twice within the same conversation. Daniel apologized later that night, explaining his mother simply wasn't good with names under pressure, an excuse I accepted at the time despite knowing somewhere underneath it that it wasn't really about names at all. 10 months ago, Daniel was in a serious car accident on a rain-soaked highway during a business trip 3 hours from home. The call came from Preston, his voice shaking, explaining that Daniel's car had gone off the road, that the vehicle had caught fire, that first responders had recovered remains too severely damaged for a traditional viewing. I remember almost nothing about the days that followed. Grief swallowed everything, the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the endless condolence calls. Vivian took charge of almost every logistical decision, insisting on a closed casket, insisting on a rushed timeline, but for everyone's sake, insisting I didn't need to see the accident report or the coroner's findings in detail because, as she put it, some things are kinder left unseen. I buried my husband 10 months ago believing every word of it. The bigger betrayal, the one I couldn't have imagined even in my most exhausted, grief-stricken moments, began unfolding slowly over the following months, though I didn't understand its true shape until much later. Within 6 weeks of the funeral, Vivian and Preston finalized a buyout of Daniel's ownership stake in Whitcomb Industrial Supply using a life insurance policy and a business succession clause Daniel had signed years earlier, one that transferred his shares back to the family in the event of his death. I received a modest settlement from Daniel's personal life insurance policy, enough to cover our mortgage and daily expenses, but nowhere near the value of his actual ownership stake in the company. A detail Vivian assured me was standard procedure that Daniel himself had arranged years earlier to protect the business's continuity. I was too devastated during those early months to question any of it carefully. Grief has a way of making people accept explanations they might otherwise scrutinize, and Vivian, I now understand, counted heavily on exactly that. About 4 months ago, small inconsistencies started nagging at me. Daniel's college friend, someone he'd known since freshman year, mentioned during a condolence call that he'd tried reaching out to Daniel's old cell phone number months after the accident, out of habit, and the number had rung normally rather than immediately disconnecting the way carriers typically handle deceased customers' accounts. I brushed it off initially, assuming a simple administrative delay. Then, 2 months ago, I received a notification from an old joint email account Daniel and I had shared years earlier for household bills, an account I'd forgotten still existed. Someone had logged into it, briefly, from an unfamiliar location, roughly 300 miles from home. I sat with that information for days, telling myself it was probably nothing, a forgotten password reset, a technical glitch. But something in me, the same instinct that had quietly nagged at me since the rushed funeral arrangements, refused to fully let it go. I hired a private investigator, a careful, methodical woman named Ms. Castellanos, and explained everything. The accident, the rushed funeral, the strange email login, the college friend's comment about the phone number. I fully expected her to come back with a simple, mundane explanation. Instead, 3 weeks into her investigation, Ms. Castellanos called me with something that made my ends shake so badly I had to sit down. I need you to understand this might be difficult to hear, she said carefully, but I believe your husband may still be alive. She explained what she'd found. The coroner's report from the accident, when properly cross-referenced, showed DNA testing had never actually been completed on the remains recovered from the vehicle, an unusual gap given standard procedure for a fire-damaged accident of that severity. The medical examiner's office, when Ms. Castellanos contacted them directly, expressed confusion, noting that a family representative, Vivian, had specifically requested an expedited release of the remains for burial, citing religious urgency, bypassing the standard DNA confirmation timeline entirely. Ms. Castellanos had also traced the email login to a small town 300 miles away, connecting it to a rental property registered under a name I didn't recognize, paid for consistently over the past 10 months, through a bank account linked distantly through several careful layers back to Vivian. I didn't sleep at all the night she told me this. I sat with the possibility that my husband, the man I had grieved for 10 devastating months, might actually be alive somewhere, hidden, for reasons I couldn't yet understand. Ms. Castellanos suggested a careful, cautious approach rather than immediately confronting Vivian, worried that alerting the family too soon might allow them to move Daniel somewhere even harder to locate, if he truly was being kept somewhere against his will, or worse, that a sudden confrontation might destroy whatever fragile situation he was actually living in. We tracked the rental property carefully over the following weeks. 3 days ago, Ms. Castellanos confirmed, through discreet surveillance, that a man matching Daniel's description had been seen at the small property, living quietly under the name David Whitmore, working occasionally at a local hardware store, appearing, according to neighbors Ms. Castellanos spoke with casually, somewhat withdrawn and isolated, rarely leaving the immediate area. I nearly drove there immediately. Ms. Castellanos convinced me to wait one more day, worried about approaching him too abruptly without understanding the full situation first. That one more day happened to coincide with a funeral in that same small town, the funeral of an elderly local business owner, someone entirely unconnected to my family, whose service Ms. Castellanos had learned David Whitmore was scheduled to attend, apparently having formed a quiet friendship with the man during his months of isolated hiding. I drove 3 hours that morning, arriving at a small chapel I'd never seen before, sitting quietly in the back row among strangers gathered to mourn someone I'd never met, watching the aisle for any sign of the man Ms. Castellanos had described. Daniel walked in 11 minutes after the service began, dressed simply, his hair longer than I remembered, a beard covering the jaw I used to trace absent-mindedly during quiet mornings together. He sat 3 rows ahead of me, unaware, grieving quietly for a man he'd apparently grown close to during 10 months of hiding from a life he was supposedly no longer part of. I don't fully remember standing up. I remember walking toward him, my legs unsteady, strangers glancing at me with confused curiosity as I approached. Daniel turned, sensing movement beside him, and the moment he saw my face, every trace of color drained from his own. "Wait, what?" he whispered, staring at me like he was looking at a ghost, which, I suppose, from his perspective, he was. We left the chapel together, standing in the parking lot under gray afternoon light, and what followed was one of the most difficult conversations of my entire life. Daniel explained, through tears, disjointed and overwhelmed, that the accident had happened exactly as everyone believed, except he had survived it, badly injured but alive, pulled from the wreckage by a passing motorist before the fire fully consumed the vehicle. He'd been taken to a small regional hospital, disoriented, barely conscious, and Vivian, arriving within hours, had made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. The accident, Daniel explained, had happened during a business trip connected to a deal that, if it had gone through as originally structured, would have exposed serious financial irregularities within the company. Irregularities Vivian herself had orchestrated years earlier, using Daniel's signature on documents he'd trusted her enough to sign without fully scrutinizing during a particularly busy period. If Daniel had returned home publicly, federal investigators already circling the company's recent contracts would have had direct access to question him, potentially unraveling years of financial manipulation that could have sent Vivian to prison. Vivian had convinced Daniel, in his disoriented, injured state, that disappearing temporarily was the only way to protect the family, the business, and ultimately me, promising him the investigation would resolve quietly within months, promising he could return once the immediate danger passed, promising she would take care of me financially in the meantime. Daniel, injured and manipulated during the most vulnerable moment of his life, agreed. Except months passed. The investigation, according to what Vivian told him during increasingly rare controlled visits, kept extending. She told him I had started moving on, that returning now would only complicate things further, that patience was the only responsible path forward. She controlled every piece of information reaching him, isolating him entirely, using his own fear and confusion to keep him compliant far longer than any legitimate investigation could have possibly required. I stood in that parking lot absorbing everything, feeling grief and rage and disbelief colliding inside me all at once. She told me you were happier without the complication, Daniel said, his voice breaking. She told me the business needed this, that I was protecting everyone by staying away. The silent preparation Miss Castellanos and I had built over the previous weeks suddenly needed to become something far larger and more immediate than simply confirming Daniel was alive. We needed proof, undeniable and complete, of exactly what Vivian had orchestrated, not just the deception, but the underlying financial fraud that had triggered all of it. Daniel, finally understanding the full scope of what had been done to him, agreed to help. Over the following 3 days, staying carefully out of sight while Ms. Castellanos and a forensic accountant she brought in reviewed everything, Daniel provided crucial context, connecting specific documents to specific moments of manipulation. Signatures Vivian had guided his hand through during his hospital recovery, financial transfers he now recognized as clearly fraudulent, conversations he remembered clearly enough to help us understand exactly what evidence to search for. We found it. Bank records showing Vivian had redirected significant company funds through shell accounts over the preceding 2 years. Documents showing she had specifically orchestrated the timeline of Daniel's death to align precisely with finalizing the business buyout that transferred his ownership stake entirely to her and Preston. A recorded phone call, one Ms. Castellanos had legally captured during her investigation, where Vivian, speaking to an associate, discussed needing David to stay quiet a little longer until the insurance and settlement clears. The public reveal happened 6 days later at a company memorial event Vivian had organized, an annual charity gala honoring Daniel's late father, the founder of Whitcomb Industrial Supply, an event Vivian used every year to reinforce her position as the family's respected matriarch in front of employees, clients, and business partners. I attended, as expected, still officially the grieving widow in everyone's eyes. Daniel waited outside, per our careful plan with Ms. Castellanos, ready to enter at exactly the right moment. Vivian took the stage midway through the evening, delivering her usual heartfelt remarks about family legacy, about honoring those who built the company's foundation, gesturing warmly toward a large photograph of Daniel displayed near the stage. "We continue his legacy every single day," she said, her voice thick with practiced emotion, carrying forward everything he believed in. I stood from my table. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, "I think it's time everyone learned exactly what happened to Daniel." Vivian's composed expression flickered slightly. "Sweetheart, this isn't the moment for—" "It's exactly the moment," I said, walking toward the small stage. "Because Daniel isn't dead." A ripple of confused murmurs spread instantly through the crowded ballroom. "Excuse me?" Vivian said, her voice sharpening. I gestured toward the entrance where Daniel, clean-shaven now, dressed in a suit Ms. Castellanos had helped him buy days earlier, walked calmly into the ballroom. The room went completely, utterly silent. "Wait, what?" Preston said from a nearby table, standing so abruptly his chair clattered backward. Vivian stared at her son walking toward the stage, her face draining of every trace of color, her carefully maintained composure collapsing entirely in front of hundreds of employees, clients, and business partners. Daniel survived the accident, I said, my voice steady despite everything shaking beneath it. He's been alive this entire time, manipulated and isolated by his own mother to prevent a federal investigation into financial fraud she unorchestrated using his signature. Daniel reached the stage, standing beside me, his voice quiet but clear as it carried across the stunned silence. She told me disappearing was the only way to protect the family, he said, looking directly at his mother. For 10 months, I believed her. Vivian's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging, her hands trembling visibly at her sides. I held up my phone. This is a recorded conversation, I said, where Vivian discusses needing David to stay quiet a little longer until the insurance settlement clears. I pressed play. Vivian's own voice, calm and calculated, filled the silent ballroom, describing exactly what she needed from the associate on the other end of the call, confirming everything Daniel had already told us. Preston stood frozen at his table, staring at his mother like he was seeing her clearly for the very first time. "Mother," he said slowly, "is any of this true?" Vivian said nothing, her legs seeming to give out slightly as she gripped the podium for support. A man near the back of the room, someone I recognized as the company's longtime financial controller, Mr. Yamamoto, stood up slowly. "I flagged irregularities in those accounts 8 months ago," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I was told that they were legacy adjustments from Daniel's estate settlement. I should have pushed harder for answers." He looked directly at Vivian. "I have the original documentation showing the fund transfers if the authorities need it." Vivian's last remaining ally in the room had just chosen truth over loyalty. Two men near the ballroom entrance, who had been quietly waiting per arrangements Ms. Castellanos had made with local authorities earlier that day, stepped forward. "Vivian Whitcomb," one of them said calmly, "we need you to come with us to answer questions regarding financial fraud and the circumstances surrounding your son's disappearance." The family reactions unfolded in stunned waves across the ballroom after that. Preston sat frozen for a long moment before finally standing, walking toward Daniel, embracing his brother with the kind of desperate relief that comes from realizing exactly how much had almost been permanently lost. "I didn't know," Preston said, his voice breaking. "I swear I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," Daniel said quietly. "She kept everyone compartmentalized. That was always how she operated." I stood beside Daniel as Vivian was quietly escorted from the ballroom, her carefully constructed image as the company's beloved matriarch collapsing entirely in front of the exact audience she had spent decades cultivating. The emotional resolution unfolded slowly over the following weeks, Daniel and I navigating the surreal, complicated reality of rebuilding a marriage and a life after 10 months of grief, followed by 10 months of a truth almost too large to process. Federal investigators moved quickly once Mr. Yamamoto's documentation and Ms. Castellanos' evidence were formally submitted, confirming the scope of Vivian's fraud extended back years beyond even what we'd initially uncovered. I didn't feel triumphant, standing in our old kitchen weeks later, watching Daniel slowly readjust to a life he'd been forcibly removed from for nearly a year. I felt something far more complicated. Profound relief tangled permanently with grief for the 10 months neither of us would ever fully get back. 10 months where I mourned a man who was impossibly still alive somewhere, being kept from me by someone I'd once, foolishly, trusted enough to let handle my darkest moment. The final lesson settled over me slowly. In the months that followed, watching Daniel readjust, watching Preston distance himself carefully from a mother he no longer recognized, watching the business rebuild under new, transparent leadership. Vivian had spent a decade assuming that control, careful and constant, could hold indefinitely. That isolating Daniel and managing every piece of information reaching both of us would allow her fraud to remain buried permanently beneath a story of tragic loss everyone had simply accepted at face value. She mistook my grief for something that would never sharpen into suspicion, mistook Daniel's disorientation and trust for something she could manipulate indefinitely without consequence. She never imagined that the widow she assumed would simply continue grieving quietly, would eventually notice the small inconsistencies patient enough to unravel everything, or that the husband she kept hidden for 10 months would eventually stand in front of hundreds of people and speak the truth she'd spent a decade making sure nobody ever heard. I never raised my voice at that gala beyond what finally needed to be said. I didn't need to. One recording, one phone call, one husband walking through a ballroom entrance everyone believed impossible did what 10 months of careful manipulation never could. Reveal the truth completely, undeniably, in front of the exact audience Vivian had spent her entire life performing for. Karma doesn't announce itself with shouting. It doesn't arrive the moment betrayal happens. Sometimes it waits patiently for 10 months, hidden 300 miles away, until the exact moment someone stands on a stage to honor a legacy built entirely on a lie. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my situation? If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, emotional drama, shocking revenge, and the justice that always finds its way back, subscribe to Story Retribution and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable. See you then.